Good morning. So glad to have you here at St. Matthew this morning. If you don't know me, if I haven't met you yet, I'm Nathan. I have the privilege of serving here as one of the pastors at St. Matthew. And this morning we get to talk about something important, something that I think is part and parcel of who we are as St. Matthew, and that is the word joy. Pastor Brad is a joyful person. And anybody familiar with the Enneagram? It's like a personality test sort of a thing, and one of the personality types on there is the enthusiast, which I'm guessing Pastor Brad is, and I am as well. And the Winnie the Pooh character that matches it is Tigger. Joy, joy, joy. Because it's so much fun. Joy. This morning we light the pink candle. The pink candle, which for me, when I was younger, was always a special candle, back even before I could count, because the pink candle meant that Christmas was finally getting close. But I also believe that lighting the pink candle on Sunday morning kicked off what is, for a child, the longest week of the year. Because Christmas is always still at least a full 7 days away. This week in the church calendar never shrinks. That fourth one does sometimes. Sometimes you light the candle and the next day is Christmas, and it's great but this week for a child just seems to drag on and on and on. But if you're a parent or a teacher, God be with you this week. Because this is the last full week, you got to get everything done. And joy consequently seems a bit ironic this week. Because it seems like it's the shortest week of the year for us. And so in the midst of all the hustle and the bustle and the wrapping and the trying to figure out which gift you're going to get that's going to be the perfect gift for each person on your list, even though the kids are going to fight about what they got, you're trying to figure all that out and you're trying to get everything done. And instead of relaxing and enjoying at the end of the day, you kind of fall over exhausted, thinking, oh boy, these are the 10 things that I was supposed to do today, and I only got 9 of them, or more likely 1 of them done, and so I've got 9 more to add to tomorrow's list. So joy. As we saw in the video, we get glimpses of joy. We get glimpses of joy in our life in special moments. At weddings, we find joy gathered around family and friends, this wonderful celebration, and it's full of joy. But sometimes the joy of that moment is fleeting. We find joy in children, in celebrating and having time with them and finding the joy that they find in the simplest and the most little things, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful, but our kids grow up and they move out and that joy fades. And I had to throw this next one in for Pastor Brad. We find joy at the beach. This is just outside of San Clemente. And joy when we're out in God's creation and in nature. And we heard in the video that the world is full of good and beautiful things. And those things bring us joy. But especially when it comes to Christmas. Underneath the Christmas tree, gathered around with family, we want to find joy as well. But sometimes these special moments, these moments with family and friends, sometimes they're filled with pain and sorrow as well, because some people aren't there anymore. Sometimes these moments highlight most of all the brokenness that's in our life because of sin, in broken relationships and friends and family members lost and gone. And yet we want joy at Christmas. And so how do we find joy? Where do we go for joy? How do we find this joy that St. Paul talks about? He says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for that is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And these words, they can almost hit you like a 2x4, like you got to do this. But I don't think that's what Paul is trying to do. And I don't think that's how we get to joy. So how do we find joy? Just as it's ironic that we light the pink candle and celebrate joy this week, it's also ironic the church's answer to joy. Because on this day, they call it Rejoice Sunday, or I'm going to mess up the Latin here, Gaudete Sunday. It goes way, way back. I think I got that. Maybe, I don't know. Good. Nobody else out there knows. I appreciate that. Thank you for being honest. That's great. We always read about John the Baptist. And John the Baptist it seems like an ironic choice, right? Who, especially Bob would really agree with me here. I saw him rejoicing about the wine. Who would think that a sober, bug-eating vegetarian would be the poster child for joy? Not me. And yet it's John. It's John that leaps for joy. It's John that leaps for joy in his mother's womb at the sound of Mary's voice. John is the poster child for joy because he's always pointing to Jesus. He's always preparing the way for the risen King. He's always pointing to Jesus. So who is John? John chapter 1 tells us who John is, and this John isn't the same John that we're talking about. That might be a little confusing. So John the Baptist is the guy we're talking about. John the Evangelist wrote the book. Just so those two people are separate, John the Baptist is not writing a book about himself here. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. John had an identity, John had a purpose, and John knew exactly who he was and what he was supposed to do. And John lived out that identity faithfully, always preparing the way, always pointing to Jesus. And I've always found this exchange in the opening part of John's gospel so fascinating. So fascinating because it's this weird exchange that doesn't go the way you think it should go. And it's exchange between the people that support the religious elite of the community and this wild man that lives in the wilderness and eats bugs. And yet we know that John's not crazy. But you would expect that as these religious leaders come to John and start questioning him, that he'd be quaking in his boots, that he'd be afraid. And as I read what the evangelist has recorded for us in the book, I don't think we're getting the whole story. I mean, imagine this was a 30, 45, maybe an all-day exchange where the religious leaders are trying to find out who this guy is that's out by the Jordan, baptizing people. They want to know what's going on. And John doesn't give them an answer, really. Let's read it. This starts at John chapter 1, verse 19. Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, "I'm not the Messiah." They asked him, "Then who are you? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." Well, there's a half answer. "Are you a prophet?" He answered again, "No." And they're going, "What's going on? What's with this guy? Why won't he tell us what's going on and who he is?" Finally, they said, "Who are you? Give us an answer." You can kind of hear the exasperation in their voices. "To take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" And John then doesn't give them what he says about himself. John replies in the words of the Isaiah the prophet, "I am the voice of the one calling in the wilderness. Make straight the way of the Lord." Now the Pharisees who had been sent questioned him, "Why then do you baptize if you are not the Messiah, nor the Elijah, nor the prophet?" He said, "I baptize with water, But among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie." And that's an answer that must have really flummoxed the religious leaders. Something big is about to happen. Something amazing is about to happen. And the religious leaders have no idea about what it is or who he is talking about. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Look," I like the old word, "behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." What an amazing thing. What an amazing place that John was able to stand. To be the one who would announce the coming Messiah, who would proclaim the coming Messiah. And true confessions here. I've always known this, but never really thought it through. I kind of had this image John sees this guy who he doesn't know walking in the crowd and says, "Oh, look," somehow miraculously through the Spirit knows that Jesus is the Lamb of God. That's somehow what I thought, even though I know that's not at all the truth. The truth is, Jesus and John grew up together. They were cousins. John grew up with the Messiah. And so when he sees Jesus coming, it's as if he's almost saying, "Hey, cousin." Just pause for a second and imagine that. John the Baptist must have been bubbling over with joy, waiting for the moment when he could announce that this is it, this is the time, this is the one. Because he's known for so long, he's been waiting for so long, and it is finally here. It's finally time for Jesus to come and reign among his people. And he gets to announce it. I find that just to be an amazing and incredible story of joy. So then the question is how do we take that from that story there and apply it to our lives? How do we become people of joy? How do we find this gift of joy underneath the wrapping that we're looking for? How do we find that gift of joy unless after all the paper is torn out and all the tinsel and string, we find that everything that we've done, and then the joy is not there. So how do we find it? John knew who he was. John knew who he was. And he never tried to be anyone else. What am I? I'm a voice. I'm a voice that gets to announce the Messiah. As God's people, we know who we are. We know who we are because we've been adopted into God's family through baptism. We know who we are because God claims us and unites us with him at the altar where he gives us his body and blood. He tells us over and over again, "You are my child. You belong to me. You are loved." That's where we start to grab hold of that joy, is by living into that identity, by realizing who we are in Jesus. So as we take that out further into our lives and realizing who we are, there's a lot of people in our world that for them you are nobody. You're just a stranger walking by on the street. But for some people in your lives, you are their world. And so as you live that identity in relationship with your spouse, with your children, you can bless them in amazing ways as you remember that these are the people that really matter. Because in a lot of places in lives, we think that, we're irreplaceable. And that the moment we say, I'm going to leave, I'm going away, I'm retiring, that people are going to beg us to stay and say, "We can't make it without you." But they're going to find someone else. And it's going to be okay. But for your husband or your wife, you're it. For your children. For those people that you have spiritual power in their lives. You can influence them in ways that make an eternal difference. So first of all, know who you are. Know who you are in Jesus. Know who you are to others. And then the second thing is to remember that you are part of something bigger than yourself. And I must imagine that must have been part of the heart of what John was all about, is he realized he was living his life into something bigger than himself. He wasn't living for himself. He was living for Jesus and the mission. I love these words from John chapter 3, from John the Baptist. He said, the bride, that's the church, belongs to the bridegroom. The friend, that's John talking about himself, who attends the bridegroom, waits and listens for him, and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine, and it is now complete. He must become greater, I must become less. If we live our lives wanting to make ourselves bigger, if we live for our egos, then we're always going to be disappointed. Because I've found that people have a way of disappointing us. People always fail to meet our expectations, especially when they're unknown. But instead, if we live for other people as part of something bigger than ourselves, if we live for serving and loving and caring and sharing Jesus with them, if that's what's at our heart, if that's what's at our core, we won't ever be disappointed in doing that. Because it's not based on how other people respond to us, but rather our carrying and bearing the message to them. You know, there was something in the video that I've struggled with and I've wrestled with. I've listened to the video probably 30 times this week going, okay, maybe I don't get this. He says that joy is a profound decision of faith and hope in the power of Jesus' own life and love. And the reason I've struggled with that is that's not been my experience. Yeah, I believe we can make a decision and choose joy in difficult circumstances, but that's not what I find. In the difficult circumstances that I've been in, it's not that I've sat there and in a hard meeting or a hard conversation said, okay, I'm going to choose joy here. That's not usually a thought that even races across my mind, even for a second. Paul said that joy, he talked about the joy of faith or joy in the Lord. You see, the thing for me is I've found myself surprised by joy in the middle of difficult and hard circumstances, because we're not talking about the plastic smile, turn the frown upside down kind of joy. We're talking about something that bubbles up from deeper within us. Something that is bigger than our emotions, ourselves, our circumstances, our relationship. Something that comes out of us from a deeper, more profound place. See, Paul talked about it as the gift of God's Spirit. The gift of God's Spirit that produces this thing in us, this joy. Paul elsewhere talks about joy as being a fruit of the Spirit. It's something that grows in us. It's something that grows in us, and it's something that we can't get, but something we receive. Something we receive by remaining connected to Jesus. See, that profound hope and promise that sustained the people of Israel, that sustains God's people in every place and time, is not something we conjure up on our own. But rather it is something that comes from remaining connected to Jesus. Comes from remembering that He is for us. This book is all about who our God is and how much he loves us and the lengths he's going to go to make a difference in our world. And so we find this joy bubbling up in us, and it surprises us as we remain connected to Jesus. It's something we receive by surprise in difficult and hard moments. Because in those moments, we realize that somehow God is in the middle of it and he's working through it. And that the circumstances that we're in, they're not the end of the story. And because God is in my life and he loves me and he cares about me, I've got proof on the cross. Something better is coming. Something better is coming as he works in my heart and my life and my relationships. And ultimately, something better is coming when he comes back and makes everything right again. Something better is coming for us. And our problem, where we lose our joy, is when we forget that. When we get lost in the hustle and the bustle. And we forget that the real gift of Christmas is a child born for me and for you. That's how we find joy. It's by remembering what is at the heart of Christmas. Jesus. Jesus born for you. When we remember that, we can know that there's something deeper, something better in the good circumstances and in the hard circumstances. Because this child has come for you. Amen.